Hello everyone, hola, buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Bienvenidos a la Feria del Libro de Oaxaca virtual.
Welcome to the virtual
conversation at this cyber Oaxacan book fair. We're very, very excited to have you, to host you at a distance. If you don't mind, I think that everyone here knows exactly who you are, but I'll do a very brief introduction in Spanish, if that's okay with you, and then we can start talking.
Fine. Go ahead.
Para quienes no conocen a Vivian Gornick,
if you don't know Vivian Gornick, she's a great writer born in the Bronx in New York in 1935. She writes essays, she's a journalist, she's written memoirs, biographies, great ones, and I will not go over her books. She has published over 11 books and a number of articles, starting with coverage of the feminist movement in the 70s in New York. And she's been part of all important media. And she has 3 marvelous books published in Sexto Piso, available here for sale in laproveedora.com. So I'll jump into a conversation with Vivian this evening. I'm really honored to establish this conversation.
I've tried to do a succinct presentation of all your many wonderful books and works. Since we're all sort of stuck indoors, yeah. I wanted to start with the outside, with the city. So whenever when the pandemic started and people would ask for recommendations of books, would ask me, what book would you read, or what do you recommend right now? I kept repeating, please go and read Fierce Attachments or Odd Woman in the City. But especially I was thinking of Fierce Attachments because of the wonderful descriptions of the city that you do. So it made me think, and I reread this book now, and it makes you feel free, even though you might be confined in an apartment or a house or wherever. And I feel like in your work, the city is not only a presence or even a character, it's company. It's almost a lover of sorts. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about the city and how the city is part of who you are and what you write.
Yeah. Well, as you have said yourself just now, I've written 2 books over many, many years. In a certain sense, the books are very separated by many decades. In another sense, they just are seamlessly a part of each other. I've been walking in New York all my life. And in fact, my preoccupation with writing about the city grew many, many years ago. I knew that I wanted to write a book in which I set myself, like a middle-aged, divorced feminist, walks the streets of a great city, and this is, of course, an activity that many, many great male writers have occupied, a position they've occupied. The flaneur, the famous flaneur in the city, who is the writer who walks without purpose through the crowd, who just walks in order to experience the randomness of life in the city. And it's been very rare that women have done it, that there's been a female equivalent of that flaneur. And I knew that I wanted to be that, because I knew since I was a kid, since I was a child, that walking the streets of the city was a great charge. It was a great renewal. It was a great excitement. It was always full of stories. Above everything else, there was always stories. The great thing about being lonely in a city like New York, especially, is you walk out in the street and you're connected immediately to the thousands of people who are acting out, who are just acting out on the street. And New York is, any world capital probably will do it. London, Paris, Rome, people are just acting out all the time. They're both exposed and intensely private. At one and the same time, you share the streets with a million strangers, and that at one and the same time, you are protected by your anonymity and they by theirs, and you feel the deliciousness of human beings expressing themselves in every way imaginable, in the way they dress, in the way they talk to themselves and to each other, the things that they feel free to do, the forms of expression, the forms of behavior. Just like this afternoon, I live on the lower west side of New York in Greenwich Village, and then there's the upper west side, right? It's a whole different neighborhood. I was just up there this afternoon, going for a walk on Riverside Drive with my sister-in-law and my niece. And here we are, three middle-aged, respectable women of the middle class, walking up a stretch of park frontage. The Riverside Drive is a park, it fronts Riverside Park. And you walk up there and there are families with babies and strollers, and there are every kind of human being imaginable. And that everybody occupies every position. And at the same time, every few blocks or so, you run into somebody who looks absolutely crazy. I mean, just crazy. And everyone just keeps going. And it's what I love in the city. And that will never fail me, never. And people I know who share it with me feel the same way. So over all the years, I used to walk, years ago, and as soon as I got home, I'd write down everything that I saw or heard on the street. And that's how I came to write The Odd Woman in the City. I had 30 years of notes in the house, which I'd never known exactly how to make use of until the moment came when I did. But if I hadn't been taking notes all those years, I would not have had a book. And I still do. I still take notes.
Yes, and it's these sort of this accumulation of wonderful vignettes of the city.
Yes.
Interspersed with reflections on friendship, which I'll get into in a minute. But I feel like there's a point in both of your books where you even say this. They were performing and you were receiving, right?
Right.
So you were just saying, you're just sort of taking in the city,
right? Yeah.
And it's all about paying attention somehow to what's going on.
Yeah. And in essence, everyone is performing. As soon as you get out in the street, you really start performing.
And did you feel, I'm wondering, especially, as a sort of young feminist in the 70s, when New York was a very different place, Riverside Drive, there wasn't even a park. I mean, it was a very different place. Did you feel that as a woman walking, you were sort of an insurgent? Like, was walking also an act of rebellion or insurgency?
No, it was never an act of rebellion, but what it was very slowly, I began to realize that as a woman walking alone and walking consistently and walking with a purpose was a position that had hardly been occupied. When I look at photographs of the city when I was a girl, and that's a very long time ago now, of the city in the 40s and the 50s, the pictures show streets filled with white men, practically no women, no people of color. No, it's remarkable how the kind of bourgeois similarity that the crowd shows, and I can't imagine myself actually walking those streets alone. When I was walking in those years, I was always with somebody else, either with other women friends, but ideally with a male friend. Ideally, you know, from college on, from university life on, I preferred walking with a man, and I didn't really know why exactly. But it just felt more natural, but safer is really what I mean. And only when I was a grown person, and from the 1970s on, did I realize by implication that the world had changed, because I was not afraid anymore. And you know, I knew that I wasn't neurotic, that if I was afraid, there was reason to be afraid. And if I wasn't afraid, there was also no reason to be afraid. So my walking the streets of New York is a measure of social change. You know, that I felt free to walk alone at almost any hour, but being careful. I mean, I knew what streets to walk on and what not. But I felt, and when I came to realize this, as I did with Fierce Attachments, when I was writing Fierce Attachments, and I was by then in my late 40s, I realized how much then I felt the city was mine, that I belonged to it and it belonged to me. Nowadays, a lot of people who look like me, white, middle class, etc., feel the city is not theirs. You know, they feel more change has taken place that has made the city look very often like a third world city. But I don't feel it's not mine. I mean, I'll never feel that. Whatever the changes are, I go with it. I mean, the city, it's in some mysterious way remains the same all the time for me. No matter who's occupying it, no matter what the color is of anybody's skin on it.
Mm-hmm. There's a point, I think, it may be in The Odd Woman in the City, where you say, I've lived out my conflicts, not my fantasies, and right. So has New York. And so, you know, it like speaks to what you're saying.
Oh, thank you for remembering that.
It's, you know, there's so many lines that are sort of singed in my memory now.
I forgot that one. I like that one.
Good one. And so now, speaking of the opposite, sort of turning inward, I would also love to hear about how you came, you know, one of the things I most admire in your writing, there's several things, but one of the ones that really blows me away every time is how you construct the architecture of feeling, how you manage to describe this inhabiting the body, and sort of the very many things that you feel. I'm thinking now of in Fierce Attachments, that moment when you feel the clarity of mind sort of to start writing, you describe as this rectangle that starts expanding. But you know, when you're sad, you also describe depression or anxiety in very particular ways, a taste in the mouth. So you build this sort of architecture of inside, you know, inside the body that also feels very expansive and very precise. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little about that.
Not much more than what you've read. I didn't know consciously that I was doing any of the things that you have just enumerated, that I was writing an architecture of emotions. The business with the rectangle, which so many people have picked up on it really always startled me. And I do have to say, I'm the least mystical person you'll ever know, but that image, it came to me almost like in a dream. I can't really account for it. It just suddenly was there. I was definitely wanting to describe what it felt like to suddenly feel clear inside, and to feel that clarity always threatened. Mm-hmm. Always threatened, that it wasn't secure and it would come and go. and that my relation both to my mother and the city, myself as a working person, was all up for grabs, that it was never solid. And that's when it hit me about the rectangle. And that when I felt clear, it expanded. And when I felt frightened or deeply uncertain, and that I could be invaded by other people's anxieties, namely my mother, that rectangle began to shrink, to move in on itself. I really can't describe where it came from or why, but there it was. I mean, the one thing that writing has taught me, nonfiction writing especially, has taught me is that it is always incumbent upon me to make a strong relation between a concrete example and a large abstract observation, right?
Mm-hmm.
The two are indissolubly linked, that there's nothing that I could ever try to describe in terms of mind or spirit or intelligence or philosophy or anything whatever it was, I had to have a concrete example or concrete image to go with it. And so there's never a moment when I'm not looking to put the two together, you know. So when I wanted to describe these feelings about wanting to be not to write, but to become a working writer, a working person.
Mm-hmm.
With me, in Fierce Attachments, being a writer is just a metaphor. It's you know what I mean? I'm using it as a metaphor for self-discovery as a working human being, right? Which over the years, many feminists have hit on that, because women who become feminists, their struggle is to describe to themselves and to the world this hungry need to be a working human being. And that's always been, at the back of my mind on almost everything that I write. Yeah. They used to say in my generation of feminists, we divided the world up between sex and work. I took work and other people took sex. And it's true. Working has been on my mind all the years. Sex can take care of itself.
And thankfully now we can read all about it in your book.
Now we can read all about it.
But what you just said also reminded me of conversation. So these moments. So this happens, I feel, in your books. These moments of clarity and connection and of sort of self-awareness and discovery either happen in these very, inwardly looking points in your life, or also when you're talking with certain friends, especially. I'm thinking of Leonard in The Odd Woman in the City, like who's, everyone's dream friend. And or in the moments where you fail to connect, and you also have very precise, sort of analyses of how sometimes connection doesn't happen and how terrible that can be. So you also said, conversation is high level humanizing. And so could you tell us a little more about friendship and talking with others?
Well, I'm sure we all know, and I'm sure you do, and we all know that how incredibly invaluable friendship is, and how much more, as in these last 40 years, as we, as feminists especially, have made such a case for us becoming working human beings rather than women whose whole life is love, right? Love, as all that has come under fire, therefore our connections with friends have become more and more important to us, more and more a source of revelation. Friendships are now more than the idea that we find ourselves in love. Many people all over the world now feel the rise in stature of friendships, because we all need human connection. We need human connection to know ourselves, to be ourselves. We don't exist without human confirmation of our existence, right? I mean, if you're not involved with another human being, you don't know you're alive. You don't know you're a human. So friendship got more and more important as romantic love and marriage took a dive, right? Now, Leonard was very important for the creation of The Odd Woman in the City. I wanted to write about our friendship in particular for many years, because I felt it was really a paradigm. It was paradigmatic of friendships today. I, the odd woman, he, the gay man, both of us New Yorkers, so supposedly very urban, if not urbane, and yet here we were, very often at odds, as well as often confirming each other. Well, I wanted to write about this for a very long time, and I couldn't find a way to do it. I couldn't find a structure for it. When I was finally ready to take out those notes and write about the city, I realized that this friendship was an accurate reflection of the way the city is being used today by people like us. And we exist now in our millions, as we did not before. I mean, New York City, 50% of all households are single person households. 50% of the census shows that all households are single person, and mostly women, but lots of men too. So it's astonishing what that means. That millions of people who are consigned to physical solitariness spill out in their friendships and their relationships into the streets of the city. And what does that feel like? So I taught myself how to use that friendship to say all this, to show how we together, and Leonard and I, and we apart, we are a reflection of what it means to be a walker in the city today. And you see, you can just imagine how different it was to be a walker in the city 50 years ago, or more, 100 years ago. And there's a long history of this. So I felt very proud that I made myself a witness to the city and to friendship and to this moment, to my time, our moment. Yeah. My friend, who was the model for Leonard, he was terrified of reading the book. And my niece, Janet, who has known him most of her life, she said to me when she read it, "Oh, I'm so glad, Auntie Viv," she says, "that you weren't mean to Leonard." They were both afraid I'd be mean. But it never occurred to me to be mean, any more than it occurred to me to be mean to my mother. I knew better. As a writer, I knew better than ever to make myself look good at their expense.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean, right?
Yes, yes. Sorry, go ahead.
It's weak writing. It's not persuasive. If I, the nonfiction narrator, am self-serving, the work is no good. The writing is no good. It doesn't have power. So I knew this as a writer, if not as a person, that I couldn't use him in bad faith. So, but they were all terrified of me.
That's great. Yeah, that's funny because I find that both Fierce Attachments and The Odd Woman in the City have, of course, in Fierce Attachments, it's your mother, it's Nettie, and especially your mother, and The Odd Woman, it's Leonard. But I feel this reminds me of this other book of yours, The Situation and the Story, which I love, and it's so helpful. Speaking of good writing, and I'm just gonna make a quick parenthesis and do a brief shout out to the woman who introduced me to this book. Her name is Silvia Aguilar, and she's a wonderful teacher and reader of your work. And she teaches, personal narrative. And so one of the things that you do so well with these difficult subjects, I mean, they're not always easy subjects. No. And in this book, you talk about V.S. Naipaul, and these two books, Guerrillas and an essay about this particular incident. And you discuss, the difference between when he's generous with the subject matter and when he, you feel like he's looking at these bugs or, trying to put them, on the page. And what you do exactly is it's never sentimental, but it's always generous.
Oh, thank you.
But I feel like I know your mom. I feel like she was my mother at some point, or Leonard is this good friend. I feel like that has to, yes. I think Jewish mothers and Mexican mothers have,
I don't doubt it.
But yes, this need for good writing that comes out of generosity rather than showing off, how smart and wonderful you are, which you obviously are, but in your writing, it's about the subject and not so much about yourself somehow.
Yeah, I hope so. Yes, I hope that nonfiction writing, as I practice it, is writing in which I use myself to write about something else. I mean, in other words, I am an instrument. My feelings are not a subject. They are the way in which I use myself to explore a subject, I hope. Yeah, anyway, that's what doing this work taught me over all the years.
And this also calls up this moment, I always, when we discussed your writing in that group with Sylvia, we were talking about sort of the way you braid different things. And then I read you talking about shaking the kaleidoscope of daily experience. And the more I read you, the more I realize, yes, even more so than braiding, it's this shaken kaleidoscope where you say you arrive at a composition that will help mediate the pain of intimacy, the vibrancy of public space, and the exquisite intervention of strangers. So it's all of these things that come together and then move around somehow.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yes.
This is you.
That was the aim. Right. Right. Yeah. Yes. That image of shaking the kaleidoscope, that came from very early feminism, in which, the very earliest days of feminism, when I realized that what we were doing was exactly that we were looking at our own experience and just shaking it up, and a new design formed as soon as you had new thoughts about who you were, what your life was about or wasn't about, and why. Those early visionary bursts of insight. But you realized you were looking at your ordinary experience, your own experience, and suddenly seeing it as you never saw it before. So the pieces were the same, but the design was different. And then I learned to apply that to writing. Yeah, that it was as useful an image as any for what people who write personal narrative are doing. When you write out of conceptions and images and situations that you're you are creating out of whole cloth, that's a whole different number. That's, you know, that's a whole different agenda. But when you do the kind of work I do, you are inevitably you are looking 6 different ways at your own experience over and over again. And so that's how the kaleidoscope image developed.
I love it. And speaking of feminism, if you don't mind, if we go into that, if we get a little into that, in Mexico, there's been a very, you know, it's been a few years coming where it really feels maybe parallel to what you lived in the 70s, like, you know, women on the streets, women's, you know, get-togethers, women assemblies, all kinds of things happening. Just recently, women took over the National Human Rights Office and sort of, you know, are now living there and sort of, you know, taking it as a, you know, symbolic but also very real protest against, you know, gendered violence and so on. And so I was wondering, on the one hand, precisely that shaken kaleidoscope, you've written how it gave you back to yourself, how feminism sort of gave you back to yourself, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, at some point you think about how before you knew it, sort of an insight became a theory became a position, and a position became a dogma. And so I feel like as feminists, we are often sort of, you know, struggling with everything that you described. So maybe since you already went through all of that, I was wondering if you could give us feminists, you know, some advice on how not to reinvent the wheel. Like, I feel like we sometimes feel like we need to reinvent the wheel, but we don't necessarily. And also how not to, you know, get caught in these dogmatic or totalitarian conclusions. So I don't know, like, I feel like you go through all of that and have thought through all of this and lived in your body through all of this. So maybe you could share some of your insights.
But what I have, as you say, lived through it all, the feminist movement has not lived through it all. You know what I mean? In other words, people like me, we are like the witnesses. We're the witnesses to what the movement, but we are not the movement. We are the witnesses. For me, what mattered was to see when things went really wrong, to see when the original insight, which was generous, you know, when it was beginning to close down, to see when it was beginning to form a politically correct line, and therefore was closing in on itself and expelling all kinds of people who were different. You know what I mean? In other words, if it's dogma, it's not open accumulation of experience and information. So the important thing for me was to learn to be on my guard against it. And it is what I try, and others like me have always tried to preach, to be against vigilante politics, to be against the politically correct, to be against forming a line which says feminists are this, this, and this, but they're not this, this, and this. The only way is to speak against it, to think about it all, to be on your guard against it. There's, you know, when you have a movement forming, thousands of people are flooding into it. There's nobody who can have any control over that. All kinds of people are coming in for all kinds of reasons. It's the job, though, I think, of serious feminists to keep their eye on the target, which is to fight the social injustice of being second-class citizens. And that's not arrived at by cutting out this one and that one and the other one. And all we can do is just, you know, you read people like me, and I read 19th century suffragists, and you know, right, and there's a big difference between those of us who were on the ground activists and academic theoreticians. there's a big difference. And people like me were more concerned, I think, with expanding and being, not purists, the opposite of purists, of expanding the invitation of every kind of woman to recognize herself in what we were saying. Now we live in a terrible time in which political correctness is, I don't know about in Mexico, but in America, I'm sure you realize, we are in the grip of political correctness, which is a very sad affair because it does exactly what we're talking about now. It says, you fit and you don't fit. You can say this, but you can't say that. You can, so we are, in my generation, everything was beginning and there were no formulas. There were no formulas for how to do it. There were those instances in which I recognized, the political correctness, the dogma forming. But in general, it was really wide open and all kinds of people were welcome to make their observations and contribute their experience. Now it feels a lot less open and a lot less generous and a lot more accusatory. I don't know what it's like in Mexico, but I know in Europe it's very much, people speak very much as you do, that you feel that things are opening up for women as they have not been for a very long time, or if ever, but you're anxious about the dogma forming. And it's the commonest experience in the world. It's the first thing that happens. People are terrified of floating in the air without rules to hold them, without being told, you're inside a set of rules that will, it's very frightening. It feels very alone, very lonely and very chancy, but it's the only way to go. I wish you well there.
So I think I think there's probably very many women in the audience nodding along with me on this. Yes, definitely. And speaking of this very particular difficult moment that the US is going through, and before I open it up to questions from the audience, I just had this one. Well, I have many questions, but our time is finite. You've written that when human experience slides off the scale and the end of civilization threatens, only hard truths will do. And I was, when I read this, I thought of you as this first generation American, the daughter of working class immigrants, in the era now, or sort of caught in the era of fake news. And so where are you finding these hard truths now?
Oh, you mean, you're asking me that in terms of our political situation? Or not?
Well, the world, yes, and also just the world even.
When I said hard truths, I meant to be as what do you call it? As accurate and as truthful about your own experience. I mean, I think that's what I meant. I can't remember what the context was of that sentence, but I mean that, for instance, if I find that in relation to the feminist movement, I hold an unpopular view, it's my obligation to be true to that view. That's what I mean by hard truths. Not to cave in to sentimentality, to call the shots as you actually see them. And that should be in your everyday political life as well as a private life. In other words, everything that happens in your own small life should receive exactly the same respect of speaking hard truths as any large worldly situation. That's what I mean. In other words, yeah. If you find yourself in an unpopular position at some feminist meeting or plan, I believe it's your obligation to stick with what you know to be true, and that's your contribution. That's your contribution to speaking the truth as you know it to be, and to be devoted to that truth, which in the end is what we're really all about, right? I mean, it's what these liberationist movements are all about. It's to speak the truth as we have actually experienced it, not received it, but as we have experienced it. That's what I mean by hard truths. That, by the way, what I comforted myself with about fierce attachments. My mother was alive, and periodically she would say, "Why are you writing this book? So everybody will know you hate me," And I would get scared, and then I couldn't write for a week. Then I'd go back and I would comfort myself by saying, I'm not setting out to trash her. I'm not setting out to make her the victimizer and me the victim or anything of the sort. I am simply setting out to speak hard truths. I am not setting out to be sentimental, and I'm not setting out to hang her. I mean, I'm not setting out to even a score or anything like that. I just want to speak the hard truth. And the hard truth is one in which people get hurt. but intention is everything, don't you think? I mean, if our intention is honest, I think we have the right and the obligation to speak the truth as we experience it. Go do it.
Thank you. It's a scary thing to have to do sometimes. And sometimes I guess you feel like the odd woman out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You are.
So I hope that the audience, our listeners, or will want to ask some questions. So here we have some questions already. So I'll start reading those out to you. They're asking you, Vivian, can you share your thoughts and expectations on the election, the upcoming presidential election? That's from Yeah.
Well, I don't know what that's worth, but I, like everyone I know, live in dread of Donald Trump being reelected. We just live in dread of it. I mean, it's a very anxious time. Everybody wakes up anxious, frightened, miserable, really uncertain. Every day, the polls show this and the polls show that. And the New York Times is losing its mind every other column. And it's a terrible, terrible time. And we can hardly, people like myself, we can hardly believe how we ever got here, how this has all happened. And we're just waiting for the shoe to drop, the other shoe to drop. But if Joe Biden is elected president, we will all be giddy with happiness. So I'm sure almost everyone in New York feels. There are Trump supporters here, but they are very few and far between. This is not Trump country, and most people in the whole city feel as I do. What else can we say?
I know. Well, I feel like it's not just you and New Yorkers. It's the whole world. I think we're all sort of biting our nails in expectation and in fear that that this will
absolutely
happen. But we don't get to vote, so we only get to watch in dread.
Yeah. I get to vote. I get to worry. Right.
Any other questions from our listeners and people out in cyberspace? I don't know. Nothing yet. Maybe. Yes, Ari is asking me which book I would recommend to start reading, Vivian. And well, I recommend all of her books, but I would definitely start with Fierce Attachments. What do you think, Vivian?
So would I. Yeah, you can start there and you can end there. Yes, yeah.
Well, maybe if while we wait for another question, I was also thinking about everything that we've been talking about. It's very, it's this need for truth, this sort of anxiety about writing about difficult subjects and so on. But one thing we've not talked about at all is sense of humor. And I think your books are hilarious also. I mean, I feel like your mother is very, very funny sometimes. Her comebacks, she is witty. And obviously this is her personality, but it's also your ear for, or some of the situations, these city vignettes where, this one woman is talking about this other woman and blah, and they're all very funny. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about not losing our sense of humor.
I'm never aware of being funny. I'm certainly not aware of being witty. Funny, I can use that word, but witty, I don't think I am. But I agree. I have a practiced ear, and I'm always looking for, I never think I'm looking for the humor in anything. It's just there. I mean, people are just wildly, what we're really calling funny is just the vividness of the theatrical quality of almost everybody's idiom. I mean, well, any large city, any great city has its own idiom, its own slang, its own way of phrasing things. The people I put on the page are quintessential New Yorkers. I mean, that's what they're doing. They're being New Yorkers and that's why I put them down on the page. And it's inevitable that they have a sense of humor. That's the nature of big city life. If you are in a city without a sense of humor, you are in deep trouble. And it's interesting, all the years of the Soviet bloc, all the years of all the countries trapped in Eastern Europe, all under the Soviet bloc, the one great thing that every traveler to all of them said was how gloomy they were, and that nobody said anything funny on the street. That people were, right. It was almost always observed that the sense of humor was gone, because humor depends on a kind of recklessness. You're not afraid to take a chance that what you say will be insulting to somebody or offensive or this or that, right? So it reflects the openness of the city when it's really working. And that's, of course, what I see and feel. So I'm very glad that, not necessarily that I have fun, not that I'm funny at all, but that the humor of the city is something I am able to capture.
Yes, beautifully captured, yes. And so we have lots and lots of questions. So Vivian, what advice would you give for someone to write without reserve, without any, sort of censorship, and to think about, and without constantly thinking about offending others? So this person, her name is Adriana Dorantes, and she wants to write many things about her family and her personal history, but she doesn't dare because she knows they're not going to like it.
So if she doesn't dare, what can I say? These are not legitimate questions to ask of a writer. These are questions to ask of yourself. Nobody can tell you how to gain the courage to write what you're afraid to write. This is something you have to, every writer comes up against this, and every writer has to solve this problem for themselves. I know a novelist who's a novelist who says, I mean, not a personal narrative, not a memoirist, a novelist who says, I write as if everyone is dead. She writes as if the whole family is dead because she's going to write about the family. And the only way she can do that is but she wants to do it more than she wants to be afraid. There's every writer faces down these fears. If you are more driven to shape your experience, then you are afraid, then you write. If you're not, you don't. There's no advice anyone can give you on this.
Sadly. And so Amparo Ortega and Perla Velázquez are asking, both have sort of pandemic related questions. So they're asking, how do you live the city and its stories now that, you know, we're in confinement? And Perla's asking, with regards to The Odd Woman, how, you know, how you speak about recognizing yourself in others and living in this city. And so how do you think that we can recognize each other when we are so far apart? I mean, you know, with screens mediating and so on.
Yeah, the question answers itself. And New York now feels sometimes like a ghost town. One of the reasons it does is because everyone is wearing a mask and people are not acting out. It's very sober, even though there are millions of people on the streets and the restaurants are with their tables out on the sidewalk are all full of people chattering away. Nevertheless, I feel very acutely the absence of storytelling things happening on the street. I really do. I mean, it's really feels sober. It really feels terrible. For the first 2 months, New York was like a science fiction movie set. I'd walk out onto 7th Avenue, a major artery, a major avenue in the city, and not a soul on the street, not a car moving, acres of concrete, empty, smooth, nothing to interrupt them. And, you know, every day for months, and you don't recover from that so quickly. So it's really, I mean, I'm sure many cities in the world feel like this now, everywhere. It's not a joke. I mean, it's really what you call a world crisis. And that we, in all our millions, have been trapped now in something that hasn't happened in 100 years. There's no way to describe it or to offer any intelligent thing to say about it. It's just to get through as best you can and is concentrate on remaining as whole inside your minds and yourselves as you can. But it's a terrible time. And I feel like I'm walking around in a fog all the time, even though I'm not, but I feel like my head is in a fog half the time, really half the time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can relate to that.
Yeah. Oh, I can imagine. We're all feeling this everywhere. It's nobody has anything really to say about it that hasn't been said already. I mean, over all these months, every banal thing has been said. We're all experiencing exactly the same things, and my spirits sink all the time. And I have a job to pull myself back up. But it is a job. It really is a job, and it's one I take seriously.
Then it takes a lot of energy sometimes. Yeah.
It does.
We have 2 questions about patriarchy.
Oh.
So Alex is asking, how you would describe yourself as a woman and woman as a construct, this social construct in a patriarchal system on the one hand, and then Teresita Cuentacuentos is asking, how can we make ourselves sort of women as we are in, constantly oppressed, let's say, by patriarchal discourse, and even many women who participate in patriarchal discourse. So how do we break free from that? And this happens in Latin America, but it also happens elsewhere, of course.
Gabriela, why don't you answer that question? You could do this as well as me. A how-to question is not legitimate. nobody can tell you how to. The fact that you ask the question is already, it answers itself. You do it by becoming more and more conscious every day of your lives, of what it is to feel to feel yourself acting, thinking, knowing, doing, in concordance with genuine self-discovery. You say to yourself, why am I doing this? Is this what I really want, or is this what I have been taught my whole life to think I want? And when we were young feminists 40 years ago, when I was doing all this and everybody else was, we were a kind of visionary generation in which we all put these questions to ourselves all the time. Where am I in all this? What does it really mean to me? What exactly am I giving up for what I'm getting here? And why do I want it? And those are all the questions with which a woman becomes a self-experiencing feminist. You say to yourself all the time, who am I here and why? And you say this in the face of a lot of pushback, and certainly from the men that you love and live with. One of the most difficult things about the feminist movement is that we're all sleeping with the enemy, right? I mean, we're always, men are our fathers, our brothers, our husbands, our lovers, our cousins. I mean, this compromises every political thought that anybody can have. I mean, the thought of coming up against the genuine hurt and pain that people all experience in these situations is deadly. It's very, you have to have the courage of your convictions. And that's something that most people develop very slowly, really slowly. You know, 6 times something will happen and you'll shrink back and say, I can't do that. I can't say that. I can't act on that. I can't. And the 7th time you'll suddenly say, well, maybe I can. And then you will. And that's how it is. It goes very, very slowly. It's a slow conversion to what you can begin to feel is genuine, authentic, legitimate. There's no how to. Nobody can tell you how to. All we do is supply the different view of history. We supply the revisionist view of our history, starting with something like Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. That's a book that grew out of a monumental desire on her part to redo the whole history. Take a look at the history of women from another perspective, from the perspective of somebody who suddenly saw that women don't really have what we've come to call agency, that we are acting more out of received experience rather than actually lived experience. And that's it. Every generation rediscovers all this. You in Europe and in Central America and South America and all over the world, in a certain sense, you're picking up where we left off 40 years ago. You know, you're asking the questions we asked then, and you're living through the same challenges that we lived through then. And everybody discovers this for themselves. And it was just as hard for all of us as it is now for you. But it's thrilling to feel yourself on the right side of history. And you are, if you, right? If you are, you're on the right side of history. If you brave down these fears of not being liked by the people you want, you know, your relatives and your husbands, it's really tough, especially in your culture. It's even harder than in mine. So I respect every one of you who makes the slightest effort to face down your fathers, your brothers, your husbands, your lovers, everybody who tells you essentially you can do this, but you can't do that. and that it's only natural for you to be in the house and for me to be out in the world, or it's not natural. It's not natural. And if you just stick to that, you'll have a brave life, live a brave life. I always thought the one thing I could respect was that we were living brave lives. Not that we would be so accomplished, or that we would accomplish what make a revolution, but that we would live lives of struggle. And I thought that was a very legitimate thing too. And I still do. I think to live a life of struggle is a very admirable thing. On that note.
Thank you, Vivian. Yes. On that note, I think we could wrap it up. There's one more question, which is a great question, I think, especially with your new book on rereading. Someone's asking Diana Santiago is asking what your favorite books are.
Oh, well, they're all in that book.
Exactly.
I don't really have any favorite books. Well, there are certain books that have influenced me a great deal. One of them is a book I talk about in this book called The Little Virtues by Natalia Ginsburg, an Italian writer who influenced me a great deal as a writer.
I love that book.
Oh, good. Me too. There is a great a book called The Odd Women by an English writer named George Gissing. There was a time when I read that book every 6 months for years. And the book remains a joy to me because it presents the struggle between enlightened men and women brilliantly. And I comforted myself with that many times. I love the work of Thomas Hardy. He means a great deal to me. So many books, though, so many books. But those are just some. Yeah, that's enough, right?
Thank you so much. Yeah, Jude the Obscure I love as well.
Oh, Jude the Obscure. Right, you can name them all, I'm sure. Yeah, all the books in that book, this book about rereading, all the books in that book have meant the world to me.
Well, I think that's a good point to stop, and maybe go and run and read one of your books or one of the books you just mentioned if anyone has them at home. But I want to thank you so much, Vivian, for talking with us this afternoon, or this evening now in New York, and for taking the time to do this online.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Gabriela.
Seriously, the pleasure was all mine. And I want to thank the Oaxacan Book Fair, la Feria del Libro de Oaxaca. Muchas gracias por la invitación a Vivian y a mí. Fue un placer platicar con ella y un honor, francamente.
Okay. Take care, everybody.
Take care, Vivian.
Bye. So bye. I just leave,
yeah.
Right?
I think you can.
Just leave, right? Okay. So long.
Bye-bye.